everyone, and welcome to the Science of Fallout series, where we're going to talk a bit about the science part of the science fiction, the background of some of the issues in the games, and some of the mad science that you can come across when you're traversing the wasteland. So today we're talking about radiation. It's one of the kind of major dangers and major issues affecting the wasteland from the fallout, hence the name of the bombs. So one of the biggest dangers in the world of fallout is radiation. It's everywhere. The fallout from the nukes, which is obviously where the name comes from, even if you survive the explosion and the shockwave, the rads will get you. So why is radiation so bad? It is everywhere. Visible light, sound waves, ultraviolet, radio waves, X-rays, microwaves, all these things kind of use or produce radiation and count as radiation. Not all radiation is dangerous though. For example, ultraviolet light from the sun helps us, and plants use the sunlight to create energy in photosynthesis. However, we do know that some forms of radiation can cause problems with excessive exposure. Ultraviolet light and sunlight increases the risk of skin cancer. X-rays are used for diagnosis and medicine, but excessive exposure can cause damage to the thyroid, to the reproductive system, and increase the risk of cancer. If you look into the history of X-rays and when they were kind of discovered and invented, the earliest kind of scientists that were experimenting with X-rays suffered severe hair loss, radiation burns, developed cancer, and some of them even died because of their exposure to this ionising radiation from X-ray machines when they were just really kind of getting started with it. So now we need to look at nuclear warfare, because again that's the big premise of the Fallout series. So nuclear fission was first discovered in 1938, and the first nuclear reactor was used in Chicago in 1942. From the dates you can tell that this is part of the Second World War, and this reactor was built as part of the Manhattan Project, which was a secret project aiming to harness nuclear power as a weapon, because we were obviously in the midst of war. The damage done to Hiroshima and Nagasaki was radiation sickness, other diseases and malnutrition. And there are reports of increased rates of cancer and birth defects. And the effect of severe radiation exposure has been well studied. From the aftermath of the atomic bombs used against Japan in the Second World War shows this. And also subsequent nuclear power station accidents and meltdowns have also given us more opportunities to see the effects on people, notably Chernobyl in 1986, Tokaimura in 1997, and Fukushima in 2011. So radiation exposure in humans, what does it do? So regular prolonged exposure can be just as devastating as a sudden explosive exposure. If you've ever heard of the radium girls, so this was women that worked in factories using glow-in-the-dark paint and painting it on watch faces and on hands. And this kind of started in about 1917. The paint contained powder radium, which gave it the kind of glow-in-the-dark effect. And the women in the factories were told it was totally harmless and that they should use their lips and their tongue to keep a nice fine point on the paintbrush for painting, so that they could paint the small hands of the watches accurately. And after a while, the women were told that this paint was harmless. So some of the women even started painting their nails with it and painting their face with it as well. Eventually, there was reported problems with these women, that they were suffering from a lot of kind of dental disease, mouth ulcers, tooth loss, and poor healing after tooth extraction. Then that progressed to reports of things like anemia, so not having enough red blood cells to carry oxygen, bone fractures, and that would be what's called a pathological fracture. So the bone's broken, it's not a traumatic injury, it's that the bone has weakened due to disease to the point where it can break very easily. and there was necrosis, so basically the jaw bone was dying and dying off. Some of the women also reported loss of menstruation, so they weren't getting their periods anymore, and they were having issues with infertility and not actually being able to conceive a child. And that confirms that radiation has an effect on the reproductive system in both men and women. So whatever organs you have, radiation can cause damage. In 1923, the first of the dial painters died after literally her jaw fell off. Like her jaw just fell off, and she ended up dying from this. More deaths followed, and despite the company's attempts to discredit these women and blame something else, the inventor of the radium paint, he had the same syndrome affecting his hands and his arms, and he ended up dying in 1928. This situation actually did go a long way towards some better health and safety at work, rules and regulations about handling dangerous materials and dangerous situations. But it's a shame that it took several people's deaths to kind of get that and achieve that. So what these women were basically suffering from is acute radiation sickness. So that is where you have exposure of more than 70 rads within a few minutes. You progress to acute radiation sickness or radiation syndrome. There's a few different kind of names for it. So radiation will affect essentially anywhere where there's rapidly dividing cells. So that's where cells are dying off and being replaced kind of on a constant basis. So if you know anything about physiology, you can probably guess which parts of the body would be affected. So you've got the hematopoietic system, sorry that's really hard to say, which is the bone marrow. So in the bone marrow is where all the blood cells are produced. Red blood cells for carrying oxygen, white blood cells for the immune system, and platelets for clotting of the blood if there's a cut or anything like that. So radiation damages the bone marrow and stops these cells from being able to be produced, which means that you'll have a weakened immune system. You will develop anemia, so not having enough red blood cells to carry oxygen, which if severe enough can lead to death. And thrombocytopenia, which is basically a lack of platelets, and that causes a bleeding disorder. So you would basically get bruises everywhere. If you cut yourself, it wouldn't stop bleeding, and sometimes things will just spontaneously start bleeding with no injury or provocation. So that's something that can make you very, very unwell very quickly. The other major part where cells are being renewed all the time is actually the gut, the gastrointestinal tract, and higher doses of radiation from kind of 600 rads upwards will do damage to the gastrointestinal system and lead to vomiting, abdominal pain, and without aggressive treatment, including bone marrow transplants and other things, it is highly likely that this is going to progress to death eventually with that syndrome. The final kind of presentation is what's called the neurovascular. So this is affecting the blood supply, and it's affecting the brain, the nervous system. So that tends to start from about 1,000 rads up to kind of 3,000. And the symptoms that you'll see is dizziness and headaches, which can progress to reduced consciousness, so in turn potentially a coma state, sometimes even seizures. And if this happens within a few hours of the exposure and there's no vomiting, it's almost always fatal. So it's very likely at these high doses, sort of 1,000 rads plus, that the person is not going to survive the radiation exposure. The other one that's kind of well known is the dermatological, so the skin can be affected, and it's referred to as radiation burn, and the reason for that is that it basically progresses like a burn that's happening really, really slowly. If you burn yourself, you go through the phases of the redness and the blistering and things quite quickly, but with radiation it happens over a longer period of time, but it progresses to sort of red and itchy skin, and then it starts to ulcerate and blister, and you will often see hair loss, which can become permanent if it's a severe kind of radiation burn and radiation exposure, but it does a lot of damage to the skin, and it can damage the hair follicles as well. So that's something that is seen in people that have suffered from radiation sickness. You can get chronic exposure to lower levels of radiation, so sometimes the damage will kind of accumulate in the body over a long period of time, and that increases the risk of damage to the DNA and the cells in the body, which can lead to mutations that would cause cancer. So that's one of the main risks of chronic low-grade exposure to excessive radiation is the incidence of cancer. So for any professions or any jobs where you are working with ionising radiation, such as working in a nuclear power plant or in the medical kind of side of things, whether it's humans or animals, using sort of X-rays and CT, which is basically X-rays as well. There are limitations on exposure and safe limits and things, and it is regulated. Certainly, when I was working as a vet, we had dose meters that we had to wear, and we had lead kind of aprons and things to protect us from the X-rays, and we had sort of rules and regulations that we had to comply with, and sort of not being in the room when the X-ray was being taken unless you had no choice, with the situation with animals and things. So it is something that can be a problem, so it's fairly well regulated for that reason. So that's kind of the real world background of radiation and the kind of situation that we see. So what about in the Fallout universe and in the game? Conveniently, your Pip-Boy has a Geiger counter on it to detect radiation, and that way you tend to know that you're kind of being exposed to it. So most of the games, they set the kind of limit at 1,000 rads. So if you get up to 1,000 rads, your character dies basically, and you'd have to kind of restart from another save, and that kind of fits with what we talked about with the effects of kind of acute radiation sickness, and that generally anything more than 1,000 rads is very likely to not be survivable. So that ties in quite nicely with the science. And one good thing is that because nuclear energy and the use of radioactive materials was so pervasive and so common in the Fallout universe, they handily do have medications that can help to deal with it. So you've got Rad-X, which basically acts as kind of a protective, so it would protect your body from the effects of radiation, and then you've got Rad-Away, which kind of cleans out your system and gets rid of the radiation. How that would actually work, I'm not sure. It's something that we definitely don't have enough data on, I don't think. There are certain things that can help for, I think, thyroid exposure and that kind of thing. But because of the nuclear war and the fallout, most people on the surface will have a low degree of radiation sickness and be exposed to it at a low level. And that was kind of demonstrated very well in the TV show on Prime, where after Lucy, one of the main characters, ends up spending some time in some really radioactive water, and then ends up drinking more radioactive water, and you can see, I mean, the makeup department did a great job on this. You can see that she just starts to look more and more unwell, until she finds Maximus and she's throwing up and passing out. So you can kind of see the progression of the radiation sickness in her, how things progress over those episodes. And in any part of the game, you find the rads everywhere. Most water sources are contaminated, and almost all of the food that you find as well. You also tend not to see a massive number of children around in various cities and settlements. Probably there is some fertility issues and, high rate of birth defects and, that kind of thing. Also, I mean, having children must be quite difficult and risky. It's not like you've got a lot of prenatal care and obstetricians and midwives around in the post-apocalypse, so delivering babies safely has got to be a lot more challenging. The major thing about radiation effects on humans is the ghouls. They deserve their own kind of in-depth look, because there's a lot to discuss about what ghouls are, how they come about, the difference between the feral and the non-feral ghouls, and the fact that they seem to progress to becoming feral after a long period of time, but they don't die of old age like a human would, and radiation actually can heal them, and they have the immunity and things, so it's quite an interesting conversation. But we do see that with the non-feral ghouls who still retain their kind of faculties, that as we get towards sort of 2300, we're getting closer and closer to sort of 250 years post bombs, and a lot of ghouls are becoming feral after a long period of time. So that's something that I want to get into in more depth, because it's a long topic and there's a lot to talk about from the different games. One thing is worth noting about the earlier games from Fallout, the first game. The radiation is there, but you have to actively check for it with a Geiger counter, unlike the modern Fallout games where it pops up on the screen and you hear the click of the Geiger counter. In the original Fallout, you don't really get any kind of pop-up or warning, so if you're not paying attention, you can die from radiation sickness, you can die from exposure and not know it. So the effects of radiation, to my mind, are represented pretty well in the game. In every game, being exposed to too much radiation does hinder you in some way. As I said, the first game, it's not really highlighted when you've been taking rads unless you check for yourself, so it can kill you without you realising. In the modern games, you are aware when you're being irradiated, but you can see if it has an impact on you. So as you progress further and further on the radiation sickness, radiation poisoning kind of scale, you'll notice that your special stats start to be affected. You'll lose endurance, you'll lose strength, you'll eventually lose intelligence, and that does progress until you reach 1,000, at which point that's the end for you and that's you done. So it's something that does then make your life harder and has an impact if you don't deal with it and treat it by either going to a doctor or taking some rad away. In Fallout 4 you can build yourself decontamination arches and things like that, so it can be done. And that's one interesting thing about Fallout 4's survival mode, is that it makes radiation that much more harsh, because you have the side effects from medications, even the beneficial medications, the ones that are less recreational, so I suppose, but you suffer some consequences for using rad away. So you reduce your rad level, but you have a suppressed immune system for a period of time, and that can lead to more problems if you catch sicknesses. So something that I think is really, really good about the survival mode in Fallout 4, and it makes radiation that much more of a threat, really, and highlights that. The other thing that I do like in Fallout 4 and Fallout 76 is that the radiation also affects your health bar now, which is a new addition, and that really does represent the fact that you'll have delayed healing, potentially, having clotting disorder, having anemia, and weakening your immune system, and just weakening the body in general, because the radiation is doing damage to your important body systems. So that's something that I think is handled really, really well, and it really does make sense that the radiation reduces your hit points, reduces your health, which means that you end up more flimsy and more at risk of dying from injuries, essentially. So it's quite an elegant way of putting that in there, and really showing you the threat that radiation is to the wasteland, and that's why it's so much more difficult for all these societies to rebuild civilization, because the radiation is still causing problems 200 and something years down the line. So that's kind of that's one of the big things about the Fallout universe, and that's obviously the name ties in with that really, really well. That, you know, this is what you're dealing with, is the fallout from the nuclear apocalypse, and you know, the whole kind of premise is about the survival and the conflicts of the people that are left and what's going on. And the one thing that's probably hindering the recovery of the human race is the radiation, and the fact that it has an effect on the environment, it has an effect on the body, it has an effect on the food supplies and things as well. You know, the carrots that you get in Fallout 4 are quite interesting looking. So obviously some of the plants have mutated in some ways, a lot of the animals have mutated in some ways, and it's probably having an effect on the human population as well. Quite well demonstrated by something that happens in Fallout 3. So when you speak to President Eden at Raven Rock, who's the kind of robot in charge of the Enclave, and he asks you to put a modified FEV, so the Forced Evolutionary Virus, he asks you to put that into the machine at Project Purity, with the idea that this virus would purify the wasteland. So it's supposed to get rid of anybody who, any living thing that has been contaminated and mutated. And he seems to think that all the people will be fine, and it's just going to be the dangerous creatures like your Deathclaws and your Yalguai and Mirelurks and everything. But whether he knows or not, it's hard to tell. And he's an AI, he's not an actual person. But and this is probably why Colonel Autumn refused to do this part as well, is because any human living on the surface probably has some hidden mutations in their cells and is suffering from a low dose of radiation sickness. Even if they don't go traversing across the wasteland and going into vaults and caves where Deathclaws live and that kind of thing, most people on the surface are going to be exposed. So the only humans that wouldn't potentially be affected by it would be those that are still living safe in the vaults, if they survive the experiments of the vaults. And when you can play the post game, after Broken Steel's been installed, if you've taken Broken Steel, if you do that and you put that virus into the water purifier and you drink the water, if you drink more than, I think it's like 3 or 4 drinks of it, your character dies, because you've contaminated the water with this virus, and it's eventually going to wipe out the entire wasteland. But there's not going to be any people that survive. The only people that would be okay would be people that have been living in the vaults. So it is something that's included in various points in the games, and I think it's handled very, very well. And it just shows that this radiation, the nuclear power, and using radioactive substances and using nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, there's risks and there's problems, and using the bombs, it causes damage to the environment and to people for a long, long time. Unlike kind of conventional ballistic weapons and explosives that just damage things and then that's it, pretty much done. But the radiation from nuclear bombs is a lot more pervasive and a lot more of a problem. So it's really good to kind of look into that. So that's the kind of science of radiation in the Fallout universe. And what we're looking at. So in this series we are going to be looking at quite a few things. We'll be looking at some of the robotics and the kind of background of that. So Robco and General Atomics, for example, and the kind of military robots that you come across, and the domestic robots you come across, and all that kind of stuff. And we'll be looking at some of the biology as well. So all these mutated creatures that you see round about, and the ones that have been created deliberately versus the ones that have kind of naturally evolved over time. you know, due to the changing kind of environment, and they've kind of adapted and grown, and all the giant bugs, which I'm not the biggest fan of, I have to say, but it is interesting to kind of look into that as well, and that's obviously my forte, is the kind of biology of stuff. So all that's going to be coming soon. If there is anything specific that you do want me to cover, then absolutely let me know. Drop me a comment or something like that. Just let me know and I'll see what I can do. And I'm happy to chat more in the comments and things as well. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. I'll catch you on the other side, and we'll see you next time. Bye.